Shabbat Shalom. So last Sunday was the 17th of Tammuz, one of the so-called minor fast days in Judaism. Doesn't mean it's unimportant, it just means we only fast during the daylight hours. And the 17th of Tammuz commemorates many things. Two of the most famous are the breaking of the tablets of the covenant, when Moses came down and saw us worshiping an idol, and the breach of the walls of Jerusalem during the siege under Nebuchadnezzar during the Babylonians in 586 BCE. But it also signifies something very important within our internal Jewish clock. If the 17th of Tammuz has come, we have begun the period of time known as the 3 weeks. This is a period of semi-mourning, no haircuts and shaving and that kind of thing, no grand joyous parties, a time to refrain from weddings and things, because it is leading up towards Tisha B'Av. The holiday of Tisha B'Av is, of course, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar for the last 2,000, well, almost 500 years, because it commemorates the actual destruction of the temple and the final outpost of Jerusalem, not just once, but twice. Once at the hands of the Babylonians, and then again in 70 CE by the Romans. But about 70 years later, after the destruction of the temple by the Romans, there was an additional catastrophe on the 9th of Av, which was the fall of Beitar. Beitar is lesser known outside of Jewish historical aficionados. Beitar was the last stronghold of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s against the Romans was an attempt to throw off the yoke of the imperialist Roman dominion. And it worked for a few years. And then Rome brought new legions all the way from Britain at that time, so we can blame the English again. And they were able to crush our revolt. And the final stronghold, the last place in Israel that was still under independent rule, was the fortress of Beitar. And on the 9th of Av, it too was captured. Now, we know all of this because, well, it was written down. The different events regarding the first and second temple are there within both the Tanakh and then later in the writings of Josephus and the writings of the sages. And Beitar as well is there found within the writings of the sages. But there is something curious that happens when we read through the writings, which is to say that the description, the extent of the narrative detail seems to increase with time. That is to say, the earliest generations immediately after the catastrophe, in particular of the Roman era, have less to say than those who came a generation or two or three later. And this has, of course, puzzled scholars, and even within the Jewish tradition, there is a discussion of why this phenomenon would occur, because most of us would expect that if you had lived through it, or if your parent had lived through it, you would have the most extensive narrative to share, that you would have all of the detail to be able to lay out exactly what had happened, to chronicle it in excruciating detail. And yet it seems to be the opposite, that those who were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren tend to have the longer discussions within rabbinic literature of what had happened rather than the earlier generations. Now, if you were of a academic mindset and one who wants to treat the text as though it were a stale and uninteresting work, but just sort of normal, then you would say, well, it's perfectly normal. Folk tales over time tend to expand. People tend to elaborate, they exaggerate, hyperbole gets added in, and then with each telling, a new layer of additional information is added, and that makes the subsequent tellings much, much longer. However, our sages, almost 2,000 years ago, said, no, that's not the explanation. And instead they gave a very counterintuitive idea. They said, look, what happened was after the disasters, the younger generations would be asking what happened, and they would begin to relate what they sort of knew. And the older generations would begin to weep. And the older generations would silence them and say, we're not talking about that. Now that may sound a little far-fetched. It may sound like an apologetic for why our texts seem to be an inverted pyramid of detail. But we have within our own living memory the exact same phenomenon. Following the Shoah, the Holocaust, we saw that the initial generation who survived, those who came out of the camps, were extremely reluctant to speak about what they had seen. That families would often not even know, except for a tattoo on the arm, that their loved one had been in one of the camps at all. And what they had experienced, what they had seen, might reduce them occasionally to tears, but tears often without explanation, without discussion. And for many, they spent their entire post-Holocaust life never sharing with their family, with their friends, or their community the details of what they had endured during those dark years. Some, much later, began to open up and to speak, and some of their children began to do even more so, and to take on tasks of researching the families that had been wiped out, to research the villages that had been destroyed, to try and recreate the detail of the world that had been obliterated during the Holocaust, to try and catalog each and every one of the crimes that had been perpetrated. Because each person in the camp only knew their own tragedy, but these investigators would try to collate, compile, and catalog the enormity of what had taken place. And so we see that immediately after the Holocaust, the oral tradition was very small. It was simply too painful to reflect upon for those that had endured it most powerfully. And over the time, over the decades, and now over generations, we have been able to expand on what we were able to gain from those who eventually opened up and what we have been able to supplement from additional sources. And so too, within our tradition, our sages 2,000 years ago, living through a Holocaust of their own, for the fall of Beitar and the loss of the Bar Kokhba revolt's independence, was a greater personal tragedy for the average Jew than the destruction of the temple. While we still mourn the temple bitterly, and we'll talk more about that during tomorrow's sermon, it was the Beitar fall, it was the Bar Kokhba revolt that ended up shattering Jewish opportunities for a true restoration of normalcy within the land of Israel. There would be glimmers over the next century or so, just enough to compile, collate, and prepare ourselves for the full diaspora. But it was following Bar Kokhba that essentially we became the Jews that would wander across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe for the next almost 2,000 years. So it is not surprising that they were reluctant to speak of it, just as people within our own lifetime were reluctant to speak of the Holocaust of our generations. But we have to remember that Judaism gives us the tools to eventually, with compassion to those who have suffered, take up their story and share it with others. That we do not simply get over it, we remember it. It does not become a lead weight around us, a ball chaining us to the past, but instead becomes a part of our banner that we carry into the future, remembering from it the lessons that we have learned, carrying forward the lessons that we must share. Now, Judaism, yes, understands and respects the need for silence in the face of tragedy, but it also understands how eventually we must transform that silence into a crying out, both to relieve the pain that we feel, but also to call attention to whatever tragedy has occurred so that it may be healed and it may be prevented. With that in mind, please dwell on the history over the next 3 weeks. Recall the tragedies that have befallen our people. Do not wallow in them through some self-pity, some indulgence of sorrow, but instead, as we weep, allow it to wash away the apathy in our eyes and allow us to see the world that is in desperate need of healing now and of the tragedies that perhaps we can avoid. Shabbat Shalom.